Well, Nick, thank you for your kind words, and thank you for sponsoring this magnificent, this magnum opus of David's. It's an absolutely defining work that contains everything that needs saying, and that will stand like Macaulay's History of England or like Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and will be read decades, even centuries from now, as the last word on Australian liberalism. So it's a very nice thing to have come all this way to say that, and thank you all very much, and enjoy the rest of your evening. While I'm on my feet, let me just say this. First of all, buy the book. It will repay the investment in terms of pleasure and interest. But you may be wondering why I've come from the UK to launch a book about Australian liberalism. Well, it's an interesting thing. The Economist magazine occasionally publishes league tables about how much countries like each other. They're asked to rank which countries they approve of. And do they approve of Israel or the US or China or whatever? Now, unsurprisingly, almost every country puts itself at the top of its own list. So almost every country approves of itself to the tune of, approval ratings in the high 90s. The one exception being the UK, which puts itself third, a whisker behind Australia and New Zealand, and actually just ahead of Canada. And in a strange way, rather as Nick was suggesting, the settler colonies, if you like, are a kind of projection to us of our best selves. It's how we imagine life would be in a more Platonic form. So here are countries that share the trappings and institutions with us, the monarchy, the parliamentary system, the rule of law, the same sense of humor, the same sports, the same indignation at injustice, the same readiness to stand up to bullies and tyrants. But somehow in a roomier and more capacious, more classless, more outdoorsy way, and more wealthy way. Right? Without disparaging the cheating Luxembourgers and Swiss, there is a reason why the flow of population from the UK to Australia has been so much greater than in the opposite direction. There are many more Nick Caters than there are Clive Jameses, so to speak. And the reason for that is, if you like, the obvious one, right? If you come from Adlington to Adelaide, doing the same job with the same qualifications, you can reasonably expect a bigger house and a shorter commute, and obviously more sunshine. So the question is why? Why is it true that a country founded later with less infrastructure, a lot of which is arid and difficult to settle, why did it become so much richer? Why is its GDP per head higher? Well, on one level, that's a silly question. It's an easy question to answer. Australia became rich for the same reason that all countries become rich, which is it pursued the right policies. Low tax, low spending, free trade, secure property rights, free contract, etc. Right? Same formula that works everywhere. Okay, that bit's easy. But let's delve a little bit deeper and ask, why did it do those things? What were the cultural factors or political factors that drove successive Australian governments of different parties broadly to make the right decisions? This, of course, is what the 5th volume of David's book sets out to explain, and I think explains very convincingly. I suppose I ought to say, because I know what it's like when you speak to a conservative audience, there will be people thinking, Struth, mate, if only you knew the truth of this place. No. This is an extremely lucky country, and believe me when I tell you that most of the world would gladly swap their problems for yours. David begins this book with a series of league tables, UN measures and so on, that measure not just wealth, not just GDP per capita, but contentment, quality of healthcare, quality of environment and so on. Australia is at or near the top of almost all of them. There is a reason why the in queue is so much longer than the out queue. There is a reason why people are prepared to take risks to try and come here, or indeed are prepared at the very least to give up friends and family and familiarity to start a new life here. So what were the factors that led to the freedom and prosperity that we can very easily take for granted, but that actually in the world are still pretty exceptional? Well, look, when you set out to answer a question that big, it's never a single simple answer. Right? But let me draw together, on the basis of David's book, what I think are some of the key contributing factors. First of all, the point that Nick just suggested. There's a nice phrase that Tocqueville uses, Alexis de Tocqueville, in his Democracy in America, where he says, the American is the Englishman left to himself. Tocqueville is obsessed with what he calls the point de départ, the point of origin of different cultures. And he has this theory that in the New World, they become exaggerated. They become, if you like, truer forms of themselves. So as he saw it, just as Spanish America replicated and exaggerated the kind of ramshackle corruption of Philip's Spain, and just as French America exaggerated the obscurantism and seigneurialism of Bourbon France, so English America, as he always called it, exaggerated the libertarianism, the republicanism, the localism that was given a freer rein in the New World than in the Old. And I think plainly you can see something of that kind playing out in Australia. There was an abundance of land, there was no native aristocracy, there was an enterprising culture almost from the off. I say almost from the off because, of course, if you go right the way back to volume 1 of this great series, there was this rather crazy attempt to fund the first penal colonies with state-run farms, which obviously, well, you all know how that was going to end, right? It's the same way that collectives always end. But as soon as the decision was made to trust to the natural enterprise and industriousness of people, even ex-convicts, as soon as they were given grants of land, you saw the beginning of a property-based and liberal system. It turned out that they were great entrepreneurs as well as being great, so to speak, preneurs, these early prisoners. And then, of course, that becomes self-fulfilling. People start choosing to come because they're attracted by the culture that has been created. So that's one factor, if you like, the geographical explanation. I think a big and underrated part of the explanation is that the UK diverged from the old dominions by being more exposed to the Second World War and the expansion of state power necessitated by mobilization. The dial never quite moved back to where it had been before 1940. Even in the most obvious sense, you know, we had food rationing until 1954, we had identity cards until 1952, we had full conscription until 1960. But when you look at the economics, the exchange controls and so on, they were there until the Thatcher government. Now here it was a very different story, because instead of Clement Attlee, you had Robert Menzies, and there was a determination to return to normal. I just want you to bear that in mind, by the way, when we think about returning to normal after COVID, because there are, again, we see the same pattern, that the state is very reluctant to give back freedoms that it seized on a supposedly contingent basis to deal with an emergency. There was a big lockdown in Victoria. Who knew? Who knew? Right. Well, make sure that it's put to bed properly and it's forgotten, and that these things are not allowed to linger. And then now this is. Okay, I got some murmurs of approval for the last one. I'm now, this is quite a high window to be thrown out of, but I'm going to say this anyway. And I think it's difficult not to conclude this after reading David's book. Australia has been relatively fortunate in the temper of its chief left-of-centre party. You don't have to look too far around the democratic world to find radical and bloodthirsty parties of the left that were determined to pull things down, that said that the revolution would be complete only when the last priest had been strangled with the bowels of the last king. Well, that was never the way, either here or in the rest of the Anglosphere. Our Labour parties, and they were Labour parties in pretty much all of the settler colonies, they were, their roots were in brass bands and working men's libraries, and they were much more interested in lifting people up than in tearing them down. And it is perhaps telling that on most measures, this Labour government in Australia is pursuing policies that are to the right, at least on tax and spend, of a Conservative government in the UK that has had 13 years in office. Right? If you like, the parameters of the debate are in a good place here. The centre of gravity is in a more favorable position than in a number of other countries. Again, I repeat my imprecation that you bear in mind that what I'm saying is relative, right? Relative to other countries. It's the most easy thing. It's natural and it's human to say, but this or that is going wrong, but this or that is flawed. Yep, absolutely. Perfection is not for this life. But most countries would swap their problems for yours. And then let me say what I think is the single biggest factor, though. It's the people. Australia has been peopled by unusually industrious and enterprising settlers, first as a function of distance and then as deliberate policy. It's even now, recall what is involved in migration. It's a big deal to say that you're not going to see your friends and family, except perhaps rarely and intermittently ever again. To cross half the world and start a life somewhere else. That is difficult even now, in an age when you can watch satellite TV from home, when there's jet travel, when there's internet connections. Imagine what it was like when the journey here could take 4 months, when it really meant that you were not going to see anybody again. There is, I put it to you, an optimism bias intrinsic in that migration. It is bound to appeal to people who are more enterprising and entrepreneurial than the mean. It can't fail to. Right? And that, again, tended to move where the political centre of gravity was, to shift it in a pro-property and pro-enterprise direction. And that then became policy. Now, David, I think in your summary, you talk about 1973 as being the year that immigration policy changes. But actually, if you look at the detail, I think you're saying that is not giving enough credit to the previous Liberal government. There was a decision made that there was opportunity to take the best and brightest from around the world, and it eventually took form in the points-based migration system that is the envy of other countries. Right? So whether people have come here from Malaysia or the Philippines or China or India, an immigration system that, if you like, encourages people to fight off competition for each space, not only guarantees a certain quality among new arrivals, but also guarantees that they will arrive patriotic, grateful, and happy to be here. Right? A very, very different way from some of the European migration systems, which were either based on taking people en masse, paying their fares, and putting them to work for the government, which unsurprisingly makes them unlikely to be Tory voters, or simply acknowledging that if they've managed to cheat the system long enough and stay in the country undetected for long enough to acquire the right to remain, that they will get citizenship. That is, if you like, a system that might have been designed to encourage contempt for the rules rather than gratitude or patriotism. Australia fundamentally is rich because of the calibre of Australians. It's important to add that an ambitious policy of controlled legal migration depends on public support and therefore confidence that the system isn't being abused. I don't think that Australia could have managed the ambitious points-based immigration system it had without the flip side, as John Howard put it, that we decide who comes here and in what circumstances they come. John Howard, by the way, gets a deserved chunk of praise in this book, but it was taken further and made the same point made even more pithily by Tony Abbott in the phrase "stop the boats." Right? It's basically the same point. And I think Tony, perhaps, if I had one criticism, Tony, I would have been a bit more generous too in this book. Not only as a liberal who, opened up trade deals and ended the subsidies with Qantas and so on, but also as the guy who facilitated the following liberal governments. Right? Without his majority, it wouldn't have happened. But that control that makes it impossible for people to cheat, or very, very difficult for people to cheat the system and elbow their way to the front of the queue, allows for a measure of consent around bringing people here legally so that they can contribute to the common weal. All of this depends on what I think is the single biggest factor of all, which is the importance of citizenship as your primary political identity. Nick and I were talking about a book by Victor Davis Hanson about the dwindling of the importance of citizenship as your chief identity and its displacement by other identities because you're Presbyterian or Indian or whatever it is, right? A modern multiracial society depends on a shared sense of equal citizenship. I don't want to presume to intrude into your domestic debates, but allow my relative kinship and my fondness for Australian democracy to say that whatever these debates are about voices to Parliament and so on, they must accept that everyone is equal before the law and that all Australian citizens have the same freedoms and the same rights. Now, that is a concept that is coming under fire, not just in Australia, but the world over. And in a way, the wonder is that it's lasted as long as it has, because we are tribal creatures by nature. We evolved in kin groups. The oldest ethic of human behavior is my tribe good, your tribe bad. That's an ethic that would have been well understood by the settlers, by the pre-settlement population here, as by our own ancestors in hunter-gatherer days, right? In evolutionary terms, we're still living on the savannas of Pleistocene Africa. The idea that all of us are autonomous individuals does not come naturally, needs to be taught, needs to be inculcated. We need an education system that preserves Enlightenment values, because otherwise people will devolve into tribalism. The great German-American historian Hannah Arendt had a nice phrase. She said, "Every generation the West is invaded by barbarians, we call them children." In other words, we all came into the world with the same mental apparatus that we would have done 10,000 years ago. The reason we don't live the way we did 10,000 years ago is because of accumulated knowledge that allows us to understand a number of counterintuitive ideas. The idea, for example, that someone you don't like might still have useful things to say. Right? There's a difficult idea, as anyone who spent 10 minutes on social media can confirm. The idea that instead of there being some truth that is there to be revealed by some elite sacerdotal class, that the truth can be temporary and contingent, that you can reach it by experimentation, and that when some better theory comes along, you can discard the old one. Right? The scientific method, all of this is alien to human nature. All of it needs to be taught, and that is the primary function of our education system. Which, of course, leads me to the thing that worries me most, not only about Australia, but about the Western world more widely. That not only our universities, but our secondary schools, the places that should be temples of the Enlightenment, instead of teaching the difficult and counter-cyclical truth that we are all individuals and are not defined by ancestry or physiognomy, are instead teaching the pro-cyclical truth and encouraging their students in the belief that the single most important thing about them is that they're female or white or whatever it is. And no open society can sustain that degree of tribalism. If we don't all believe that we're citizens equal before the law, then very quickly a democracy breaks down. As the great American economist Thomas Sowell once put it, you can't sustain an open society on the basis that two babies born on the same day arrive in this world with a set of pre-existing grievances. Right? When you put it like that, it is very hard to disagree. So let me finish in introducing David by issuing a cry for you to recall what is recorded here and to act on it. Remember who you are. I never come to Melbourne without going to your Shrine of Remembrance. I'm sure that it's such a familiar landmark to some of you that you walk past it and no longer particularly register its presence. But believe me when I tell you that no visitor from the UK can do that. It's the thought of all those young men crossing half the world to fight for a country that in many cases they'd never set eyes on is something that moves me as much now as when I first visited this state. And I'm always struck by the hard, pithy, lapidary inscription there, "This is holy ground," right? Which ends with the fantastic sentiment, "Ye therefore that come after give remembrance." I think part of being an Australian means communicating to your children that whether their grandparents were from Ukraine or Greece or Korea or Vietnam, they are now heirs to a sublime patrimony as Australians. That they are not just a random set of individuals born to a different random set of individuals, but that they are inheritors of this tradition of freedom, and that inheriting it from their parents imposes upon them, imposes on every Australian, the duty to hand it on intact to the next generation. Ye, therefore, that come after, give remembrance. Ladies and gentlemen, David Kemp.